Margaret popped a hot chocolate onto her boss's desk with a cheeky smile. She had news, but it looked like Esme's was more pressing. "Nothing a few melty marshmallows can't take care of, I hope." Esme whirled round in her chair with a glowery frown. Not her usual demeanor. Oops, maybe it really was a disaster. Margaret's news should definitely wait. Making the most of her Scottish lilt, she crooked a finger and said, "Come on, girlie. Out with it." Esme looked out the window bleary with rain and sighed. "I can't believe it's going to be Christmas in 3 months. Ah!" Margaret waved away the forlorn comment. "It'll be snowy and gorgeous before we know it. We'll be in our glad rags raking in money for this year's charity, and all will be well." She dropped into the chair next to Esme's desk and felt the job offer letter shift in her back pocket. She might not be here come Christmas, but Esme didn't need to know that straight away. "Come on now, tell your bestie what's going on." "It's the ball." Esme dropped her head into her hands. The Christmas charity ball. It was the fanciest event Margaret attended each year. Correction, it was the only event she went to each year. Black tie, anyway. Long-term broken hearts had a way of setting the bar too high. It was the only explanation she had for her abysmal dating life. It wasn't like she pulled out her heels to work here at the Canine Therapy Center. In other words, a certain blue-eyed, black-haired Scott Campbell had a lot to answer for. She gave Esme's arm a squeeze. "What's wrong? Is the venue already booked?" Through her fingers, Esme moaned. "Worse, so much worse. The charity I was going to support has just been shut down as a front for money laundering." Margaret's plan to tell Esme about her job offer evaporated. Canine companions for the elderly. This was bad. Esme was a strictly by-the-books kind of woman, and the annual Christmas charity ball she hosted was attended by Scotland's wealthiest elite. Asking for donations to a fraudulent charity would be devastating for her. As one of 2 heirs to the Heatherglen Castle estate, she was vividly aware the public eye was on her. Apart from the obvious living in a castle, Esme was not one to flaunt her very serious wealth. It was one of the many reasons being her friend was so easy. That, and she was one of the only other 30-somethings in Clwch who was still single and loved a good chick flick binge on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Speaking of which, "You up for a bit of box set action this weekend?" Esme shook her head. "I'd love to, but with this mess to sort out and the Christmas carnival coming up, I'm going to be tied to the office." Outside Esme's office, the door opened into the main reception for the Canine Therapy Center, followed by the sound of muffled male voices. One was Hamish, the young lad from down the village doing work experience. The other was strangely familiar. Goosebumps familiar. No, couldn't be. More likely someone from the vet's surgery next door. Silly little tricks her mind was playing on her, most likely. The Hope Springs eternal kind. Scott pulled up to the Canine Therapy Center, the windscreen wipers on his new truck ably keeping up with the rain. The one plus side to what he'd been through was the payout from the insurance company. Faulty equipment for firefighters had a way of making pretty bad headlines, especially when there were casualties. The eye-wateringly large check hadn't bought his silence, but along with his own savings, it had bought him a ticket home, a new truck, and if he wanted a deposit on a pretty nice house. The house he'd set out to earn money for all those years ago. The house he'd risked his life for. What a fool he'd been, on so many levels. The one thing a check couldn't buy him was a future with a certain green-eyed, flame-haired beauty he'd treated like dirt. He'd thought his plan was clever at the time. Double up a life goal to become a smoke jumper with a juicy savings account so they could put a deposit on a house. He'd been a magpie. Reading the bits of the contract that spoke to his hopes and dreams, ignoring the bits that didn't. Turned out, cocksure newbies didn't get the big bucks. Like experience, you had to earn it. He'd learnt the hard way. He scanned the area. A few warm lights glowed through the murk up at the castle. Tough to picture it through the gloom. Back in the day, it had been a plain old family home. It was a full-fledged medical rehab center now. Took in all sorts of folk from every corner of the globe. People who'd suffered devastating injuries and were trying to rebuild their lives. Exactly the type of covers all the bases rehab center his mom had begged him to transfer to. The kind that dealt with every aspect of a man. Body, brain, heart. The first two he'd sorted. Lord willing, he wasn't too late to put the third part right. 4 years wasn't most girls' version of, "I'll be back soon." If there was one thing he knew about his girl, it was that she was proud. Proud enough to tell him where to stuff it when she laid eyes on him, whether or not she felt whole again. He'd had pride in abundance when he'd set off to Canada. About his work, his career ambitions, the secret plan to buy Margaret that little stone cottage by the loch they both loved. Then, he'd changed the goalposts. Long story short, he'd stacked his priorities in the wrong order and worn his professional pride like a badge straight up until the moment the flames hit his back. That pride and his priorities had melted along with his faulty uniform. It had been the hardest battle he'd ever fought to rebuild things the right way round. He stared out at the rain, unconcerned about making a dash for the large covered entryway sheltering the front of the Canine Therapy Center. Wet was safe. This kind of wet anyway. Again, the filters fell into place. The ones that blurred the images of the men he'd worked alongside, pulled farm animals out of flooded rivers with trudged through acres of pristine mountainside, covered in thousands of pounds of avalanche snow with. The men who'd lost their lives in a fire that had scorched thousands of acres of pristine woodland. He squinted against the gloom. A few months ago, he would have said the weather suited his mood to a T. A few months ago, he didn't know if he was coming or going. Didn't know how to see the bright side as he worked his way through rehab. His colleagues told him he was lucky. It was the first time he'd laughed in months, but there'd been no mirth in it. Until one day, he'd finally reached a crossroads. Choose life, or give in to the misery. If anyone out there should know life was precious, it was him. So here he was, on a mission to live it to the full. His hands tightened around the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The love of his life was in there. What had happened between the time he'd sent that email and now was anyone's guess. Single, married, upped, and moved on with her life the way he'd said he'd moved on with his. Not many women took to being put on the back shelf for 2 years, then told to forget their promises of a shared life of family. Right. Enough dithering. It was now or never time.
"Margaret!" Esme wailed. "Are you even listening? Charles is going to go mad if this gets out."
Margaret made sympathetic noises, trying to shake off the weird sensation that she'd just heard the one voice she'd thought she'd never hear again out in the reception area. "What Charles doesn't know won't kill him. He's always off in Charles' world half the time anyway, so there's plenty of time to fix it." Esme's older brother was a neurosurgeon who definitely preferred thinking to talking. He would have been a brilliant, glowering, romantic hero in a costume drama if cutting-edge medicine wasn't his thing. He'd be quite the catch if she fancied the tall, dark, and silent type. Instead, alas, she liked the talk, dark, adrenaline junkie type. The types who are impossible to pin down to a small Scottish village. True. Esme swirled her finger through a chocolatey marshmallow, her eyebrows diving towards one another as her brain tried to unpick the problem. It It reminds me so much of back then. Back then was a dark time for Esme. Life had blown up in a big way, and they'd gone through dozens of tissue boxes. Margaret decided to can the job offer. Chance of a lifetime. Absolutely. Just like when Scott went off to Canada. Well, a bit different. Her sister was at university now. Back then, the idea of leaving her parents to help her wheelchair-bound little sis had been a no-brainer. It had ripped her heart out to tell Scott she had to stay in Scotland while he did his wildfire fighting training. But she'd believed him when he said he'd be back in 6 months. She also thought she'd wanted the job. But now that she had the offer, it served as a reminder of how much she loved the life she'd rebuilt here when Scott made it crystal clear he wouldn't be coming back. There was no way she could compete with helicopters and mega forest fires, and who knew what else Canada had to offer. So, whatever. Never mind the fact that working for the Highlands Rescue Squad had been their shared dream when she and Scott had first met. He was a firefighter. She was a qualified vet nurse. A match made in heaven. Within months, they'd had their futures perfectly mapped out. Train with the rescue squad breed dogs for mountain rescue, just the sort who had found her sister when she'd fallen off her horse on a cross-country yomp and start a family of their own. For 4 incredible years, they'd worked towards that goal. Then Scott was offered the opportunity of a lifetime. Big paychecks, bigger fires to fight, a chance to be a smoke jumper. She swallowed back the bile-laced memories. She'd had offers, too. Offers she'd refused because her family had needed her. So she'd waited, prayed actually for Scott to come back as promised. First 1, then 2 years slipped by. Then that one solitary email arrived, making it very clear he was never coming back. There'll always be a place for you in my heart, jerk. Who wanted a place in a heart that was black with lies? After a month of incredibly ugly cries, she'd pulled her socks up and asked Esme for a full-time job here at the Canine Therapy Center, determined to grow a spine, save some money, and leave the perfectly perfect cocoon of Heatherglen Castle Estate one day. That day could be now, but her friend needed her. Her best friend. And if Margaret had learned anything over the years, loyalty was a rare commodity, one to be cherished at all costs. She mentally crumpled the job offer and gave her friend a hug. Listen, Ez, we'll sort it. Before you know it, this will be nothing more than a tiny little blip. She bit her lip and looked away. That was what she'd told herself 4 years ago, when the love of her life had boarded a long-haul flight to Canada with a promise to come home 6 months later. Margaret tipped her head towards the castle. With Christmas coming up, Mrs. Renwick will be starting her trial runs on bitchies soon. They'll cheer us up. Esme gave a conspiratorial laugh. 3 months and counting! She straightened herself up in front of her computer screen. Let's just hope Santa finds us a perfect charity as an early pressy. Moments later, Esme jabbed her finger at the computer screen, where the news headline made it abundantly clear. Canine Companions for the Elderly was definitely not going to be their celebrated charity this year. I'm going to need 1,000,000 biscuits to make this go away, Margaret whistled. That bad? That bad? Esme scowled. Margaret nodded sympathetically. She'd eaten about 1,000,000 of Mrs. Renwick's biscuits when Scott had gone to Canada to be a wildland firefighter. 6 months training, maybe 6 months on the job. Tops. Then we'll be together again, babe. You and me against the world. Or Scotland, anyway. And maybe that had been the problem. Her dreams had always been here in the Highlands, and his had been global. It was why she'd applied for the New Zealand job, to push herself out of her comfort zone. See if she'd been too insistent that they could be happy right here in Clucklockery Village. She'd always believed happiness was who loved you, not where they loved you. More fool her. Esme's phone rang. Margaret could hear Hamish's cracking man-child voice coming through the line. Esme's shoulder slumped as she hung up the phone. Could you do me a huge favor? Absolutely. Anything to get her brain back on track. There's some guy in reception who's looking for a dog to adopt. You're better at sussing them out. Not true, Margaret said, though it was nice to have the compliment. And B, this isn't a rescue center. Why'd he come here? Esme shrugged, her attention already half back on her computer screen as she trawled through yet more damning headlines. Says he wants a reject rescue dog. We don't have rejects. Margaret bristled. The dogs they bred and raised here were happy, healthy, incredibly talented pooches that changed and saved people's lives every day. Sure, not all of the dogs that passed through their doors were perfect for the myriad of jobs she trained them to do. But the ones who couldn't pass the final exams weren't rejects in her eyes. They were repurposable, a bit like her, and her mountain rescue skills had been when her blue-eyed boyfriend of 6 years had decided their shared dreams weren't good enough anymore. She'd focused on something new, raising and training the working dogs who'd saved her sister's life, and her life had become better for it. Mostly better anyway. Sure, one half of her large, cozy bed was unoccupied, but all work and no play had turned Margaret into a survivor. The type who did her very best to live in the moment, because sulking about a future she was never going to have was too painful. Move on. I'm a different man now. Though there'll always be a place for you in my heart, it's time to go our separate ways.
Hello, Earth calling Mags. Are you going to talk to him?
Margaret gave her head a shake and smiled at her friend. Only because it's you. She gave Esme a quick squeeze, then stared at the door, trying to imagine who could be on the other side. Tall, dark, twinkly blue eyes that made her tummy flutter. She fuzzed her lips. Wishing for her dream man to appear on a day like this was like hoping Santa Claus would bring her a private island for Christmas. A knock sounded on Esme's door as it opened. Sorry, I'm looking for Esme, an all too familiar voice began. Margaret's entire nervous system shot to high alert. Scott Campbell was back. Scott sucked in a breath. He knew that look. Shock. Dismay. He felt it too. Seeing the new man, he was reflected in her eyes. He'd left Scotland a rugged game on for anything Jack the Lad, and had come back a 32-year-old man too wise for his years. Some, his physio for one, would say he'd become detached. He called it wary. Wary because he knew a heart still beat in his chest, and he was about to find out if the woman who it beat for would have him back. After all he'd put her through, he knew he didn't deserve it. He'd had his reasons, but he'd learnt the hard way there was no gain without the pain of trying. Scott! Margaret's voice was barely audible. What are you doing here? Margaret. Her name bloomed on his lips. It tasted like sugar and meant I love you. Margaret, He took a step forward. The blonde woman, Esme, he presumed put a hand up for him to stay where he was, then put a protective hand on Margaret's arm. Is this the Scott? Margaret nodded, those green eyes of hers never leaving his. Esme Ross Wilde, meet Scott Campbell. Instinctively, he tugged his collar up around his neck where the scarring was the worst. His hair covered the burns on his scalp, and his perma-stubble hid the small streaks of scarring along his jawline that would mark him for life. Not that it mattered. What had truly cut him to the core was watching his best mate lose his life in the same cruel forest fire, knowing there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, stemming. What was it? A sob. Horror. Joy.
Scott! Are you all right?
Her question exploded in his chest like fireworks. She hadn't moved, wasn't throwing her arms around him, but there was compassion in her eyes. The film of tears glossing over those green eyes of hers told him she could see he'd been through hell. He prayed that those unspilt tears were proof he'd come through the other side, proof she could love him again. Esme shot him a look so cool he actually felt the temperature drop. "Margaret's actually very busy right now. What can I help you with?" There was a knock on the doorframe. A serious-looking chap around his age stepped in mid-30s, rusty-colored hair, a few inches shorter than him. Maybe 6 foot and a bit. He was carrying a file that looked like medical records. Scott should know. He had a similar one in his duffel bag sitting in the back of his truck. "Lyle, hi, perfect timing," the blonde woman said, sending Scott the side-eye. "Oh, what the had she called security?" Esme addressed Lyle. "Margaret's ready to show you round the kennels for that patient you've got coming in. Cassandra, was it?" Lyle looked between the three of them, visibly confused. Margaret said, eyes still glued to Scott. "If you don't mind, I think I need to hear about the reject Scott was after." Margaret could barely hear the words coming out of Esme's mouth for the roar of blood pounding through her head. Something about how she'd be a shout away if she needed her. Closer, if necessary. Scott Campbell, as she lived and breathed. So many nights she'd lain awake preparing the speeches she'd give to him if they ever crossed paths again. And now that she had her chance, nothing. Not a single solitary useful word was coming to mind. After Esme bustled Lyle out, saying something about rescue dogs they had in training, Margaret felt Scott's presence every bit as much as she had that very first time she'd met him at Mountain Rescue Training Camp. Tall, charged with life sexy as all get out. "I didn't mean you," Scott began. "With the reject mutt thing. That wasn't—" "I know." Margaret cut him off. She wasn't ready yet, ready for this moment. 2 years to process her rejection, and she thought she would have been all fire and brimstone, ready to claw his eyes out, wave her job offer in his face, or whatever it was that made for a triumphantly cathartic moment. But all she could do was stare at him. He was different. His dark hair was longer. It was still thick and inky, but unlike the short regulation crew cut he used to wear, it now hid his collar in soft waves. The stubbly beard was also new. It suited him, but spoke to an air of worldliness that now hung about him. Not a fancy big city worldliness. Those blue eyes of his that used to shine so bright had an unfathomable depth to them now. A wisdom. He looked as though he'd lived and seen both sides of the coin. Something bone deep was telling her he'd been through the mill. The old Scott wouldn't be standing there all serious and expectant. The old Scott would have laughed, pulled her into his arms, and danced her around the room to the tune of a Scottish reel only the two of them could hear. He would have held her in a bear hug, their two hearts pounding together, their breath joining as one so close she felt safe and delicate all at the same time. At 5'10", it took a lot to make her feel delicate, and Scott had made her feel all woman in all the right ways. "So," she forced on a bright voice, "what brings you to Heatherglen?" She could have tacked on after all these years, but something about the way he was looking at her told her he'd done plenty of beating himself up over the way he'd ended things. "You," he said simply. The word hit her like Cupid's arrow, then burst into flame. Who did he think he was? Romeo Don Juan? Both! He couldn't just waltz in here and win her back in so much as the blink of an eye. He's the one you've been waiting for. Well, she held out her hands. Here I am. Was the dog thing a ruse to get to see me, or were you actually after a dog?
A bit of both.
He scrubbed a hand through his hair, and that was when she saw it. The scarring that could only come from one thing: fire. The look of concern in Margaret's eyes told Scott all he needed to know. Coming to Heatherglen had been worth it. He may not win her back, but he just might win her forgiveness. She was crazy beautiful. More all woman than the girl he'd left behind. A woman he ached to take a vow for. To care and protect. It was what had made him send that insane email 2 years back. He hadn't been fit to care for anyone then, and protect. There were a fleet of doctors and nurses on his case to drop any and all pretense of that skill. He'd felt every bit as useless as he had when he'd watched his best mate's parachute drag him into one of the worst fires he'd ever seen. "Scott!" Margaret protectively crossed her arms. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" He did, but not here, and not now. "Do you mind if we take a look at the dogs?" She threw him a confused look. "Are you staying?" "That depends." "On what?" Her shoulders stiffened. He hated seeing her respond so defensively, but he only had himself to blame. He'd told her in no uncertain terms that they were over. Mistake number 2. The first had been leaving. He'd known she couldn't leave her family. Not then. He'd stupidly thought the smoke jumper training in Canada wouldn't wait. At the time, it had made perfect sense. Margaret would stay and help her sister Becca. He'd put his head down, become the best smoke jumper in living history. Put aside a nest egg the two of them could use for a house. A place where the little ones they'd have one day could play out in the woods, unlike the inner city balcony he'd had to play on. Talk about not seeing the wood for the trees. He'd let a hard knocks childhood override the fact that he'd found the love of his life, and his real priority should have been making her happy. He knew it might take a while, but he was going to do everything in his power to try to do just that. There was a ring in his pocket. He'd been carrying it like a talisman for the past 2 years. It symbolized the lifelong promise he wanted to make the house he was hoping she'd want to move into. It would stay in his pocket for the time being. He needed to take things slow. Build back the trust he'd lost. Make sure he was as ready to be loved as he was ready to love. There was no way he'd break a promise to her a second time. "Come on, show me round. I think you'll agree I need to explain things." She huffed out a laugh. Her fingers traced along her collarbone, her green eyes slipping to half-mast before they flared open in a blaze of frustration. "What aren't you saying, Scott? I can tell you've been through something awful, but unless you explain everything to me, I'm not letting you anywhere near my dogs, let alone my heart. A short tour, that's all I ask. I'd love to see what you've been up to since you up and left me," she cut in. He couldn't help it. He grinned. There she was, the feisty Scottish lass he'd fallen for harder than he'd fallen for anything outside of fighting forest fires. He saw the corners of her mouth twitch in response to his smile. The urge to pull her into his arms and kiss her swept through him like wildfire. And just like that, he sobered. "What?" Margaret's brows tugged together. "Why have you gone all frowny?" "Nothing, I just..." How did he tell her what really happened about the chopper being hit by gusts of wind, falling along with his best mate, their chutes catching air in the nick of time, only for the fire that raged around them to turn direction? "Come on then, let's go see the dogs." Her voice cracked as she continued. "It might be nice for you to meet a truly loyal companion. This place is incredible." Scott looked genuinely impressed. "The dogs are brilliant. I always knew you'd be an amazing trainer." As much as she tried to resist it, Margaret couldn't keep the pride out of her voice. "I told you we didn't have rejects." "Seriously, Mags, He reached out and tucked a lock of her dark auburn hair behind her ear. "They're a credit to you." As much as she wanted to lean into his touch, she pulled away the old nickname trickling down her spine like warm caramel. He smelled the same, like the forest after a sharp rain, fresh and intoxicating. But there was so much he wasn't saying. He'd obviously been in some sort of accident, experienced a deep trauma. If her work with the dogs had taught her anything, talking about something that painful took time. The secrets these pooches kept. She sucked in a sharp breath and turned to another section of the kennels. "If you are serious about wanting a dog, there are a couple down here we'd like to find homes for, but we have very strict rules about who we rehome them with. People who can keep a promise, for starters." To her surprise, Scott leant against the wall, crossed his legs, and gave her one of those lazy half-smiles of his. "That's something I've been working on." Oh no. He was flirting. She'd always been powerless against him when he was flirting. The next thing he'd do was push up the sleeves on his shirt. He knew she loved his forearms. They were all strong and defined and capable. She tried to channel an inner ice queen, forcing her gaze away from temptation, her eyes dropping to his wrists. His cuffs were firmly buttoned. Her gaze shot back to his hairline, where now that she knew it was there, she could see the hints of scarring. Her eyes skidded down to the stubble that suited the new Scott. Whoever that was. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw yet more scarring through the dark facial hairs now dappled with the odd streak of silver. Against her will, her heart ached for him. Ached for the pain he must have had to endure, and for the support she could have given him if only she'd known. Support he'd refused by dumping her cold turkey. She took a beautiful golden retriever out of her kennel. "Meet Fergie. Perfect in every way other than the fact she doesn't like lifts, which makes her ineligible for service." Margaret could feel Scott's eyes on her as if they were heat. She cleared her throat and rattled off the list of rules and regulations in place for adoption. And the most important one is that the owner be consistent. Dogs like routine. If you can't offer that, I'm afraid it's no dice. Their eyes clashed and cinched. He knew what she was saying. "If you're here to stay, I'll listen. If not, you need to walk away now." "Come to dinner with me." Margaret laughed with surprise. "What, tonight?" "Yes, tonight. What's your local no?" He waved his hand between the two of them. "Somewhere special." "Where would you go for somewhere special?" Against her better judgment, she told him. The Heather and Hare. It was a gastro pub in the next village she'd always wanted to visit, but hadn't found the right excuse. Like a date. Just to be clear, this is not a date. Someone had to draw a line. Right, he nodded solemnly. The gesture spoke volumes. He wasn't here to flirt or mess her around. He was here to gain back the trust he'd lost when he'd sent an email shattering a love she'd once thought unbreakable. "Whatever it takes, Margaret." Margaret stood at the entryway to the Canine Therapy Center, in a state of shock, watching as Scott's taillights disappeared. She was going to dinner with her ex. Her evil ex who'd gone to Canada to be a smoke jumper and had dumped her after 2 years without so much as an explanation. Her not-so-evil ex who looked as though he'd been taught far too many life lessons at such a young age. Margaret. Esme turned her round from the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the entryway to the clinic. "Are you all right?" Margaret gave a perplexed shrug. "I think so." "You told him where he could shove it, right?" Esme was suitably indignant for a best friend. We're going out tonight." "What?" Esme's eyes virtually popped out of her head. "On a date?" "No," she scoffed. "It's not a date." "It's completely a date. You're blushing." Damn her Scottish complexion. No amount of freckles could ever hide her blush when it hit this hard. Margaret Murray, could you please explain to me why you're going out with the man who smashed your heart into a million pieces? Pieces I helped pick up, if you recall. Margaret didn't even try to protest. Esme had been the one who'd picked up each and every shard of hurt and pain, the one who'd shaken them out, then put them back together until she was near enough the same old Margaret again. Except, of course, for that piece of her heart that would always be Scott Campbell's. There was no way she could go through that again. Fine. She'd go to dinner, listen to his sob story, then tell him to take a hike. Esme looked up as a woman covered in a Heatherglen mac ran through the front door. All right, Flora, wet enough for you. Margaret looked back over her shoulder to the clinic where they trained patients and dogs. Do you have someone who needs a session? I saw Andy earlier. I thought he was the last appointment. Esme harumphed. She's only asking because she has a date tonight. Oh. The physiotherapist shook her head. I thought you'd given up on online dating. It's not a date, Margaret protested, feebly. It's Scott Campbell, Esme informed Flora, crossly. Flora's eyes widened. The firefighting chap who... Esme pressed her lips together and gave a sober nod. Exactly. It's not a date. Neither Esme nor Flora, also single, seemed remotely interested in her opinion. The pair of them nattered on about the sheer madness of her decision-making until Margaret finally put her fingers in her mouth and blew a sharp whistle. Flora, she said, smiling. Is there anything I can help you with that is work-related? Flora grinned, totally unfazed by Margaret's indignation. I was after Cassandra Bellu's files. I think Lyle accidentally left them down here. The woman who had the accident in India. Aye, that's the one. She's in hospital in Germany right now, but'll be coming in a month or so if all goes well. Margaret checked the clipboard behind the counter. She wasn't on my list to get a dog? No, she won't need one. It's physio she's after. I think Lyle just wanted to make sure there weren't any dogs around exactly like the one she lost. Lost. Search and rescue, Esme explained as she headed to her office and found the file. Lots of casualties. Oof. That must have been painful. She might have wished many things about Scott, but dead was never one of them. Flora thanked Esme, pulled her mac hood back over her head, then threw Margaret a cheeky smile just before she left the clinic. Have fun on your date. Not a date. Margaret turned on her heel and stomped off to the kennels, a smile playing on her lips. One thing Scott had never felt with Margaret was uncomfortable. Tonight, however, with a dark story to tell, he felt crazy uncomfortable. The menu looks good, Margaret said. So many starters. Have you ever had a soft poached quail egg? Scott looked at her. Menu talk had never been a part of the wit and repartee they'd shared, laughing, joshing, and talking until the stars faded into another day had been just a few of their many fortes. Discussing the finer points of garlic mushrooms versus the whiskey-marinated salmon was not. I messed up. Margaret put down her menu and met his gaze straight on. Is this the part where I say, yes, you did, or the part where I let you explain yourself? Scott smiled, giving in to the urge to brush the backs of his fingers across her freckly cheek. Damn, she was a beauty. She pulled back from his touch, a reminder she was no pushover. Quite the opposite, in fact. She was smart, courageous, unbelievably kind, and had not deserved to be treated the way he'd treated her. I think we both know I owe you more than an explanation. Margaret raised her eyebrows. First and foremost, he cleared his throat, I owe you an apology. Margaret nodded, not lowering herself to asking for what. He appreciated that, was grateful for it actually. There were plenty of smoke jumpers who'd bragged about the trails of broken hearts left in their wakes, laughing at the inevitable fallout. Exes who'd left their firefighting boyfriend's clothes cut up in shreds car tires, slashed social media filled with public shaming. Margaret hadn't done any of that. She'd sent him an email with one line in it, "Message received." Opening that email had flipped a wavering switch in his heart and plunged his world into darkness. Self-blame, survivor's guilt, the physical anguish of the burns that covered his back, his scalp, and his face were nothing in comparison to how much it had hurt to tell her it was over. The charcoaled icing on a cake topping off 2 years of treating Margaret extremely poorly. He'd felt so useless, so incapable. Stuck in the burns ward after he'd seen everything he'd worked towards disappear in a flash. All he'd wanted was to do his job and to buy his girl a house. But at what cost the life of his best friend? The shattering of his confidence. If only he'd had the strength, the courage to reach out to her, he knew Margaret would have reminded him that 4 walls and a roof didn't make a marriage. 2 people in love did. He'd let his mother's endless nagging at his father to get them out of their tiny council flat and into somewhere proper color his role as a man. He knew now that his role as a man was to respect and honor the woman he loved, not push her to the side when he'd needed her most. At the time, he thought he was doing her a kindness, saving her from having to care for him. What woman would want to devote herself to an utterly broken man, seeing the core-deep hurt in her eyes told him he'd been little more than cruel? No excuses, but as a way of explaining, I think it would be fair to say my ego took over my heart for a while there. You think... She waved the waiter away. Fair enough. He wasn't hungry either. The smoke jumper thing was... It was pure adrenaline. Macho alpha male stuff. Me against a raging fire. Just tell her the truth. Tell her you were trying to make both of your dreams come true and that you failed at both. My professional ambitions should never have outweighed my personal ones. And those were... Margaret asked after a moment's silence, proving I wasn't the man my father was. One thing Scott had never felt with Margaret was uncomfortable. Tonight, however, with a dark story to tell, he felt crazy uncomfortable. The menu looks good, Margaret said. So many starters. Have you ever had a soft poached quail egg? Scott looked at her. Menu talk had never been a part of the wit and repartee they'd shared. Laughing, joshing, and talking until the stars faded into another day had been just a few of their many fortes. Discussing the finer points of garlic mushrooms versus the whiskey-marinated salmon was not. I messed up. Margaret put down her menu and met his gaze straight on. Is this the part where I say, yes, you did? Or the part where I let you explain yourself? Scott smiled, giving in to the urge to brush the backs of his fingers across her freckly cheek. Damn, she was a beauty. She pulled back from his touch. A reminder she was no pushover. Quite the opposite, in fact. She was smart, courageous, unbelievably kind, and had not deserved to be treated the way he'd treated her. I think we both know I owe you more than an explanation. Margaret raised her eyebrows. First and foremost, he cleared his throat, I owe you an apology. Margaret nodded, not lowering herself to asking for what. He appreciated that. Was grateful for it, actually. There were plenty of smoke jumpers who'd bragged about the trails of broken hearts left in their wakes, laughing at the inevitable fallout. Exes who'd left their firefighting boyfriend's clothes cut up in shreds car tires, slashed social media filled with public shaming. Margaret hadn't done any of that. She'd sent him an email with one line in it, "Message received." Opening that email had flipped a wavering switch in his heart and plunged his world into darkness. Self-blame, survivor's guilt. The physical anguish of the burns that covered his back, his scalp, and his face were nothing in comparison to how much it had hurt to tell her it was over. The charcoal icing on a cake topping off 2 years of treating Margaret extremely poorly. He'd felt so useless, so incapable. Stuck in the burns ward after he'd seen everything he'd worked towards disappear in a flash. All he'd wanted was to do his job and to buy his girl a house. But at what cost the life of his best friend? The shattering of his confidence. If only he'd had the strength, the courage to reach out to her, he knew Margaret would have reminded him that 4 walls and a roof didn't make a marriage. 2 people in love did. He'd let his mother's endless nagging at his father to get them out of their tiny council flat and into somewhere proper color his role as a man. He knew now that his role as a man was to respect and honor the woman he loved, not push her to the side when he'd needed her most. At the time, he thought he was doing her a kindness, saving her from having to care for him. What woman would want to devote herself to an utterly broken man? Seeing the core deep hurt in her eyes told him he'd been little more than cruel. No excuses, but as a way of explaining, I think it would be fair to say my ego took over my heart for a while there. You think? She waved the waiter away. Fair enough. He wasn't hungry either. The smoke jumper thing was pure adrenaline. Macho alpha male stuff. Me against a raging fire. Just tell her the truth. Tell her you were trying to make both of your dreams come true and that you failed at both. My professional ambitions should never have outweighed my personal ones. And those were, Margaret asked after a moment's silence, proving I wasn't the man my father was.